No, there's a difference between fiction and nonfiction. I really like watching movies like Remember the Titans or movies like that, where at the end of the movie, after you watch this scenario unfold, it tells you what those individual characters are doing now. This person got a scholarship to this university, this person's playing ball, this person's back working for the school district or whatever, because you have a sense that this is real life, it really happened. It's so much different than watching a movie or a TV program where you know everything's just fiction. And when somebody decides they've had enough, they just write them out of the script. They have them die or they have them move away. And they just sort of dispense with them rather easily by writing them out of the dialogue, and they just sort of go away. That's what fiction does. But nonfiction's a little bit different because it's reality. It actually happens. And one of the unfortunate things about the Bible is that when we read stories, especially in the Gospels, we seem to think they're fiction. We seem to think that they're concocted, that they're sort of made up. And we don't realize that these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are documentaries. These people really lived. They interviewed people who really lived. And this is factual, it's not fictional. And that's why when we have a weekend like we had last weekend where Dr. Winja comes to be with us and he deals with science, we're reintroduced to the fact that science, the job of science, is to deal, as Nathan talked about this morning in Sunday school, with facts. And why things happen and that they happen. And so they try to get to the real facts. Stephen Hawking is an atheist, and he writes these words: almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Now that's an atheist that writes that, who is supposed to deal with facts. And he says in the 21st century, in 2000, that scientists believe that the universe had a beginning, the Big Bang. Now the Bible is 3,500 years old. And the first words of this 3,500-year-old book says this: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Stephen Hawking is still an atheist, but he believes that the universe had a beginning. Now to me, if you're going to have a beginning, you have to have a beginner. But he takes the beginning, but doesn't take the beginner. And so today we're going to talk about determining what's important. If you watch CSI or a show like that, and they uncovered a body that had 3 bullet holes in it in a shallow grave, would you infer that that person accidentally fell into this hole with such force that 3 bullets pierced his chest, causing him to die, and then the wind blew dust over the hole until it filled it up, and that was the explanation for why this person died? If you were watching CSI and the investigators came to that conclusion, you would probably change the channel. Because it doesn't make sense. You have to determine what's important and take the evidence to come to the right conclusion. That's why this week has been so maddening. We all know the story of what happened in Las Vegas. 59 people lost their lives. Over 500 people were whisked away to hospitals across the city because one man with a cache of semi-automatic rifles decided that this needed to take place. And everybody's asking the same question. Why? They want to get to the motive. And so they've dispatched investigators. They've sent people to the Philippine Islands to bring back his girlfriend to interview her because they can't stand the thought that this just happened and there wasn't an explanation. Can you imagine how maddening it must be for Jesus to be looked upon as fiction when he knows it's a fact that he exists, when he knows it's a fact that he created the universe and all that's in it, when he knows that it's a fact that he gave up being equal with God and became a human being just like us. And he walked with people in life and they had no idea they were walking with the Son of God, which was a fact. Now, it's always amazed me that Jesus didn't feel compelled to tell people why. He didn't tell people why things happened. He didn't tell people how the universe came to be. He didn't explain to them gravity. He didn't explain to them the laws of the universe. He didn't explain to them what happens when you look into a microscope or what happens when you look into a telescope. He just helped them live life and determine what's important. So I just want to go through very simply this morning, how do you determine what's important? Number one, you need to ask Jesus to stay and not leave. You know, when we get in trouble is when we come to the place in our lives when we ask Jesus to politely excuse himself. And when we ask Jesus to leave. In Luke chapter 8, verse 37, Jesus has just cast a legion of demons out of a man and expelled them into pigs, and the pigs ran off a cliff and drowned. Over 2,000 pigs. When that happened, this is what Luke says in Luke 8:37. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into a boat and returned. You see, these people thought what was important were pigs, were their salaries, were their vocations. They didn't think Jesus was important. And so they politely asked him, could you please excuse yourself? And so Jesus obliged them, and he got into the boat and left. The contrast to that verse and verse 40 is amazing. Because when he arrives on the other side of the lake, this is what Luke says. Now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. So the first thing we have to determine when we decide what is important and what's not important. As Christians, we have to decide Jesus is more important than anything else. He's more important than my job. He's more important than my pigs. He's more important than anything. And I want Jesus to stay. Secondly, we have to ask for his help. Now, what we're about to read is a kind of a two-story experience that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These stories are very carefully tied together. And as we go through the story, remember, this is not fiction, this is fact. This is a documentary. This really happened. And so you have to ask yourself, why is Luke telling this story to people who will read it? What is Luke hoping that you will take away from reading this story? And I'm telling you this because the story, the crux of the story, is about two ladies. And Luke thinks these women are very important. Now that's odd because in the society where Luke lived, women weren't important. But to Luke, these women were important. And so why is Luke talking about two women to a man who's reading the story? And what is Luke hoping this man, who's not a woman, is going to derive from learning about this story? So let's read the story. And there came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. And falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house. Now, Mark tells us that Jairus asked Jesus to come lay his hands on his daughter. He was the leader of the synagogue, which meant that he was in charge of who was going to read scripture, who was going to do meditations, who was going to preach, who was going to pray. And he had one daughter, his only daughter, and that daughter meant everything to him. But the problem was, he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. Now when Jairus came up to this problem as the leader of the synagogue, as the gentleman who handled the religious logistics of the religious community in which he lived, he had to make a decision. This isn't going to look good. I'm going to go seek Jesus, whom people in other synagogues and people in the temple don't like. But this is very important to me because I care about my daughter more than what other people think. And so he leaves the synagogue, he leaves the traditions to go find Jesus. He determined what was important. Now I need to say something right here that is so easy in church to forget what's important. Because we all have our kind of areas of responsibility. And we all try to get these things done. And sometimes it's easy to forget why we do them. And sometimes we forget what the real point is. And so Jairus came to the conclusion that God wanted his family and his role as a father and his wife's role and his daughter's role, that was the most important thing. And so he decided, I have got to go find Jesus. It's important that we all understand that it's not how big your problem is, it's how big your God is. And Jairus had come up to a problem that he could not solve. So he went to get help from Jesus, not from the synagogue. And then Luke goes on and says, as Jesus went, the people pressed around him. So if you could think a bit about being at a Mavs game, or being at a concert, or being at a Cowboys game, or being at the Byron Nelson, or being someplace where there's lots of people at the Meyerson downtown or a concert, when there's intermission. And all these people crowd towards the doors to get out to the lobby. And you have to politely wait your turn because of the press. So all these people were pressing Jesus. Jairus and Jesus were leading the group. And they were walking to Jairus' house because Jairus was anxious for Jesus to get there to heal his daughter. And then Luke writes this. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Now this is a very private, personal thing. It's not something you talk about with people. And in the religious community, in the Jewish community, this woman would have been classified as unclean. And so she wanted to keep her condition as secret as she possibly could. And then Luke goes on to say, and she had spent all her living on physicians, and she could not be healed by anyone. Now, I don't know if you've been to the doctor lately, but you know there's nothing more exciting in life than a doctor's appointment. You go into a doctor's office and all the magazines are out of date, and you have to wait and wait and wait. And then they give you forms to fill out. And they ask you the same questions over and over and over again. Then you get into the doctor's office and you sit on the little table or the chair, and the nurse comes in and asks you the same questions over and over again. Then they take your blood pressure, and then you wait and wait and wait for the doctor. This woman had spent 12 years trying to get help. She visited experts, she'd visited specialists, she'd visited GPs, she'd seen nurses, she'd seen doctors. She was tired of dealing with this issue of blood, and she just wanted it to go away, and it wouldn't. Now, when we study on Tuesday mornings from the book of Chronicles, and the other day we were minding our own business, studying 2 Chronicles chapter 16. And we just accidentally came upon this verse. And I want to read this to you. Yet even in his disease, his is Asa the king, he did not seek the Lord, but sought help from physicians. And one of the problems with going to the doctor is you think it's the doctor's responsibility to heal you. And it's real easy to take your focus off God and put your focus on the doctor. And this lady had done that for 12 years. She hadn't felt good for 12 years. She was tired of feeling the way she felt. She just wanted to feel good again. So finally she got to the place where she decided, I have got to go see Jesus. Sometimes it's easy in life to get so wrapped up in seeing doctors, we forget to pray. James, Jesus' half-brother, says this, is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. I had a really, really, really close friend who was dying of cancer. And I went to him one day and I said, how's your prayer life? And he said these words, it doesn't exist. Now what was he saying? He was saying, I feel so lousy I feel so bad. I just can't bring myself to pray. I just can't do it. And this lady had finally gotten to the place where she says, I can't do this anymore. It's not a prayer of resignation. It's a prayer of relinquishing, where she says to herself, God, this is yours now. I'm just coming to you. If this is what it is, then so be it. But just please help me. She came up behind Jesus and she touched the fringe of his garment. Now, many people think that she touched his hem or the lowest part of his robe, but Jewish people had a prayer shawl that they threw over their shoulder, or a lot of times if you wore a robe, you tied the robe around you and then you threw the robe over your back, and there was a tassel on the robe that all Jewish men had. And many people think that this lady came up to Jesus and she grabbed the fringe, she grabbed the tassel on his garment. And Luke uses the word strangled, which meant that she grabbed the tassel with everything she had. And immediately, her discharge of blood ceased. She was healed that fast. She came up secretly. No one knew what was going on. She didn't make a big deal about it. She didn't want anybody to know. But she grabbed on to the tassel of Jesus' robe. And in that instant, she was healed. This is not fiction. This is a documentary. And Jesus said, who was it that touched me? So the disciples are there, and Jairus is there, and Jesus is there, and Jesus stops. And he says, who was it that touched me? And this is a big deal to him. But why in the world does Jesus say it that way? Who was it that touched me? And when all denied it, Peter said, Master, the crowds surround you and are pressing in on you. How are we supposed to know? So here's a dad who comes to Jesus on behalf of his little girl. And here's a woman who's been sick for 12 years and just wants to feel good again. And both of them converge on Jesus. And Jesus thinks both of them are important. I think this is so interesting that Luke wants us to know it's 12 years. The little girl was 12 years old. Now, it doesn't say that she was sick for 12 years. It just says that she was 12 years old, which meant that probably this little girl was bringing her mom and dad incredible joy for 12 years. They were just enjoying having a little girl. How much different those 12 years were for them than the 12 years for the woman with a hemorrhage. And sometimes we wonder, why does God let me hurt for 12 years and somebody else feel good for 12 years? It doesn't seem fair. Why? But Jesus isn't in the business of saying why. Jesus is just in the business of meeting us at the moment the 12 years are over. And so we need to seek his help. And if you're in this room this morning and you have not sought the help of Jesus in your circumstances, please, even if you don't feel like it, even if you're tired of talking about it, please seek his help. Number 3, but you have to trust him as he works it out. But Jesus said, Luke says, someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me. Now, why didn't Jesus just let it go? Come on, Jesus, this is real personal. Please don't do this. But Jesus stops, and he wants to make sure that everybody knows about this lady. Why is that? Because Jesus wants to make sure from this moment on, no one treats this person as an outcast anymore. That she is included again. That she is a part of the family. That she is a part of the society. That she's a part of the culture. So Jesus stops to make sure everybody sees this woman. Somebody touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out of me. And it's interesting that Jesus says, when something happens in faith, something goes out of God into that person. And when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she touched him. Can't you just see this lady? So embarrassed. For 12 years she's been dealing with this. And now all of a sudden, what she hoped and prayed would happen to her, it happened. And now Jesus wants everybody to see her. And he said to her, I love this part. Daughter. He was going to heal Jairus' daughter. And he calls this lady daughter. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Now, if I'm Jairus watching this, I might be a little antsy that Jesus stops to deal with this lady, but a part of me is encouraged because I'm thinking if Jesus will stop for her and call her daughter, then there's hope for my daughter. And while he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, your daughter's dead. Do not trouble the teacher anymore. But Jesus, on hearing this, answered him, don't fear. Only believe, and she'll be well. And when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James, because that was important to Jesus. He determined what was important, and for some reason Jesus thought it was important that Peter, John, and James go with him, with the mother and dad, into the room with this girl. And all were weeping and mourning for her because they were making a priority. They were determining what was important was that this girl should be properly mourned for. They were doing the religious thing. But he said to them, do not weep, for she's not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called her, saying, child, arise. And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. You kids need to remember this. She's 12 years old, and Jesus thinks she's important. Her spirit returned, and she got up at once, and he directed that something should be given her to eat. And her parents, this is an understatement, her parents were amazed. Now this next part of the sentence makes no sense to me. So you've got all the mourners here who are crying and wailing. You've got the people playing the flutes because they're playing a dirge. You've got the people there with the funeral beer because they're ready to have a burial service. The whole village knows that Jairus' daughter has died. And then Jesus turns to Jairus and Mrs. Jairus, and he says these words. And he charged them to tell no one what had happened. Duh. What are we supposed to say? What do we do when we walk out of the room? What are we supposed to tell these mourners? What are we supposed to tell these people who've come to have a funeral? What do you want us to say? Well, Jesus was making a point. I'm not doing this for notoriety. I'm not doing this for a photo op. I'm not doing this for publicity. I'm doing this because you're important to me. I'm not doing this because publicity is important to me. I'm not doing it because I want to be popular with people. I'm not doing it because I want people to think I've got some incredible power. I'm doing this because I genuinely, absolutely care and love your family. And I love your daughter. And I want you to know that. So what is Theophilus supposed to think when he gets to the end of these two stories? What is Luke trying to bring into the life of Theophilus as he reads about this incredible event that happened in the life of Jesus? He wants Theophilus to understand, don't ever ask Jesus to leave. Don't ever be embarrassed of him. Don't ever be irritated with him. Don't ever be frustrated with him. Please never ask Jesus to leave. Welcome him. Number two, you need to seek him. You need to grab onto him. You need to trust him because he wants to help you in the present need you find yourself. And you got to be patient because Jesus works some ways that you don't understand. He stops for people you might not stop for. He thinks something's important you might not think is important. But you need to understand you have his undivided attention. One of my big heroes growing up was a gentleman named Peter Marshall, who was a preacher in Washington, D.C. He was a chaplain of the United States Senate. He was called the preacher for preachers. He was a preacher for senators. He was a preacher for congressmen. He was he had a brogue about him as he spoke. And his wife's name was Catherine. And Catherine contracted tuberculosis. And she was bedridden for months. And she and Peter Marshall had prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed for God to heal her. And he hadn't. And one Sunday morning, Catherine Marshall was listening to Peter preach on the radio. And he preached about this story. And in that moment, Catherine Marshall reached out to Jesus. A prayer not of resignation, but a prayer of relinquishment. Lord, if this is what you want, if this is what you have for me, then I just give it to you. And when Peter Marshall got home from church that day, his wife walked down the stairs to meet him as he walked in. People had told Catherine Marshall that God didn't do miracles anymore. I don't believe that. I believe God does miracles every single day. And we're going to sing an invitation hymn today. And if you have a need this morning and you need God to meet you wherever you are, we have guys standing at the front who want to pray with you. We're not bringing out the snakes or doing any kind of weird stuff. But I just want all of us today to understand, I believe with all my heart, that God still does things you can't explain. He still works in ways you can't understand. And he wants to meet us in this moment. If you'd like to receive Jesus as your Savior, if you want to join our church, if you just want prayer this morning, that's why we sing this song. Let's pray and then we'll sing.